On issues from Black Lives Matter to trans rights, the Labour leader Keir Starmer seems desperate to avoid taking part in any culture war. But in refusing to fight, are Labour just surrendering to the right? That's the theme of tonight's show. And Keir Starmer, on his media round this morning, gave us loads of material to work from, to interrogate those appearances and what Labour is, I suppose, intending to do on issues of gender identity, of racism. And, well, imperialism is going to come up as well during this show. I'm joined by Aaron Bastani and Ash Sarkar. How are you doing?
I'm extraordinarily good. It's great to see you in the studio, Michael.
Yeah, no, we've had a bit of a chaotic start as I try and angle the camera in the correct way. And my head's a bit bigger than yours, but I think that's going to be fine. Just before we went live, I should say, Aaron said, I bet you're going to say that Nigel Farage retweeting Keir Starmer is a good thing. And I'll give you a spoiler. I don't think that's a good thing. Although, I don't think it's the end of the world either. Maybe we'll discuss that as the show goes on. You can let us know your thoughts by tweeting on the hashtag TiskySour as ever.
There's like the best looking one of the lot, and the most intelligent, and the most Twitter followers hasn't been introduced.
Oh, Ash Sarkar. I swear I introduced you both.
No, you only had eyes for Aaron. As always, it's the two of you keying all together, and then who am I? The cat's mother. Awful.
My apologies. That's a big faux pas. How are you doing, Ash?
Oh, it's fine. Like you care.
He's still like, he's just like 98% of his brain is taken up by, wow, my head looks so big. That's what he's thinking about.
That is, he spent a lot of time with me. He can read my mind. All right, my apologies.
Keep the show moving.
My apologies to Ash Sarkar. We're going to start the show. The Black Lives Matter movement has proved tricky for Keir Starmer to navigate. So far, he's backed symbolic gestures in favour of the movement, but condemned any form of direct action. On BBC Breakfast this morning, Starmer was asked a policy question, what he thought about the demand to defund the police. Let's take a look.
That's nonsense, and nobody should be saying anything about defunding the police. And I would have no truck with that. I was Director of Public Prosecutions for 5 years. I worked with police forces across England and Wales, bringing thousands of people to court. So my support for the police is very, very strong and evidenced in the joint actions I've done with the police. There's a broader issue here. The Black Lives Matter movement, or moment, if you like, internationally, is about reflecting something completely different, and it's reflecting on what happened dreadfully in America just a few weeks ago, and showing or acknowledging that as a moment across the world. And it's a shame it's getting tangled up with these organisational issues, with the organisation Black Lives Matter, but I wouldn't have any truck with what the organisation was saying about defunding the police or anything else. That's just nonsense.
Okay, we're going to talk in a little bit about whether or not the demand to defund the police is something leftists should be adopting. We're going to go in depth into that policy question. But first, I want comments on that particular intervention from Keir Starmer. So those are the notable things that he's trying to say. The Black Lives Matter movement is actually a Black Lives Matter moment, and also calling the demand to defund the police nonsense. Ash, I'll go to you first for your thoughts.
I mean, what Keir Starmer provided there was an example of what I call the fraff tiramisu. It's just layer of fraff upon fraff upon fraff, soaked in fraff with a fraff mascarpone whipped on top. It's just complete nonsense from top to bottom. Now, I'm not saying that because I entertain some kind of bizarre notion that Keir Starmer, former Director of Public Prosecutions, is going to be an abolitionist when it comes to police or prisons. I don't think that. But what I expect is that the leader of a left-wing party in the UK can at least understand what Black Lives Matter is. It's certainly not a moment. It's not like Me Too. It's not just a hashtag. It's a global movement. And that it has demands beyond getting white people symbolically to take the knee and say that they themselves think that Black Lives Matter. It's always been about more than that. And it's always been about more than simply reflecting what's going on in the United States. The reason why you've had tens of thousands of young Black and Asian people out in the streets in the UK. It's not simply about George Floyd. They're talking about Shukri Abdi. They're talking about Mark Duggan. They're talking about Azelle Rodney, Belly Majinga, Smiley Culture, Jimmy Mabenga. Those are the names on their lips. It's a distinctly British issue, as we've talked about many times on this show before. And when it comes to defunding the police, just to sort of come into that point, I would expect Keir Starmer not to back the call to defund the police, because I don't think that's where his politics sit. I don't think that that would be authentic or honest to who he is as a politician or as a man. But I would expect him to have some understanding of what it is. People aren't advocating defunding the police because they want the police to simply be punished in some way. They're talking about defunding the police as a reallocation of funding. Now, in the US, which is where this demand has emerged in particular, it's a result of inflated budgets when it comes to spending on police. It completely dwarfs anything like education or healthcare, social work, things of that nature. It's a bit different in the UK in terms of the allocation of budgets, but you can still make a case for there being more funding of social work, mental health care, education, which both prevents crime, because these are all preventative measures. They address social ills, but it also shifts the pool of behaviors that one would consider criminal away from the police. And it's saying that these are social problems which will be dealt with in a socially progressive way. Now, he could have said any one of those things, or he could have talked about the Lammy report. He could have talked about the recommendations made by his own shadow justice secretary for reforming the criminal justice system, and said that that's what he would like to see, if not defunding the police. But he didn't do that. He went straight for this culture wars narrative, discrediting Black Lives Matter and reducing it to a moment, and also treating the demands as nonsense. It's disrespectful, and it shows, I think, a level of pride in ignorance almost, which I would have expected from many other politicians, but not Keir Starmer.
I'll go to you in one moment, Aaron. First of all, I just want to, I suppose my take on this is I think that we have to recalibrate our expectations of what a social democratic party should do. So I think we shouldn't expect the Labour Party to be a movement party. So I don't think we should expect Keir Starmer to sign up to all the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement. But you've got two options, sort of, if you want to be a progressive party. One is to say we'll support the movement in general, but obviously we're not going to just adopt all of its demands. We make our mind up about those independently. And the other is to try and actively defang a movement, to sort of to almost claim ownership of it and change what it means to be part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think Keir Starmer went for the latter, which is the unhealthy option. Aaron, what did you make of it?
Yeah, I think you've both put it incredibly succinctly. First point is this is meant to be someone, if nothing else, who is incredibly on top of their brief, well-informed, highly knowledgeable, very intelligent man. Nobody's going to dispute Keir Starmer's an intelligent person. He was Director of Public Prosecutions. He clearly is very good at synthesizing information very quickly, as any top lawyer is. Yet he doesn't appear to know what Black Lives Matter actually is. You know, he says, as we've already talked about, it's a moment where we reflect on racialized policing in the United States. Well, that's not what it is. You know, people weren't pulling down a statue of Edward Colston in Bristol because of, you know, the murder of a man in Minneapolis. It was about the racialized nature of contemporary policing, but also where that sits within broader geographical and historic context. And that's why we're having this whole conversation around statues and whatnot. So you've gone from this huge, expansive conversation to actually Keir Starmer can't even talk about the embryo, the seed, the kernel of the whole conversation, which is about how Black people's experience of policing is significantly different to white people's. And the most worrying thing of all for me in that dialogue, or monologue he gave rather, was him saying, you know, he verbatim said, I'm not really going to listen to anything the organization has to say. It's not for a white man to discern what are the legitimate parameters of anti-racism, particularly when he's denigrating an organization comprised exclusively of Black people. It's idiotic. Now, people would say, well, you're coming for Starmer. Oh my God, you're trying to cancel Starmer. I don't think Ed Miliband would have done that, by the way. I would go further, and you're saying, well, look, it's no longer a movement party. We're going to have to accept these kinds of things. I think any smart social liberal would have given a better answer than that, which is why I was so surprised, because I thought, if nothing else, Keir Starmer is a social liberal. This is somebody who's campaigned for the end of the death penalty around the world. He believes in human rights, civil liberties. As Ash said, he could have given a very lucid, literate response on some real key aspects of this and say, look, we're not going to agree on everything. We're going to agree on some things. And we can use that as a minimal kind of set of orientations to proceed forward together and improve policing for minorities in this country. Really simple. But the arrogant nature in which he dismissed it, I think, is really, really concerning and revealing. And is this how he's going to treat what he would view as otherwise minority, unimportant issues? I suspect he might, because we have to remember this is not a particularly mature politician. He's only been in Parliament for 5 years. And what it showed more than anything, I think, is a lack of maturity in his political judgment. He's speaking publicly to millions of people. What he says will be scrutinized incredibly, exactingly. And it's almost like he wasn't prepared for that.
Ash, we're going to go in a moment to a clip about Angela Davis talking about defund the police for us to talk about, the policy in general. But did you want to come back on Starmer specifically first?
Yes, I just want to come back on Starmer specifically, just to say two things, which is one, if you want an example of a politician who got talking about Black Lives Matter right, it's Rishi Sunak. So his statement in terms of hitting the notes of empathy and respect had it all. Now, we all know that his party are not interested in the pursuit of racial justice. We know that, in fact, that they're committed to the policies which deepen and entrench racial inequalities at every level in our society. But in terms of getting the tone right, he's someone who definitely did that. So it's not as if Keir Starmer, by being better on this issue, would have been way out to the left, out on a limb and kind of politically isolated. He would actually sort of be sitting within the mainstream of politics at the moment. The second thing that I want to talk about is he had nothing but unconditional praise for the police. The same week, a news story has broken that police officers have had to be suspended because they took selfies with the dead bodies of two murdered Black women, Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman, just in Brent. And that's something which I've not heard many politicians talk about. The fact that these two women went missing, the missing persons report wasn't taken seriously. It was one of the victims' boyfriends who, when going out to look for the two women, found the bodies. And then the two police officers who were there with the bodies took selfies with them and posted them to a group chat, which included non-police members of the public. That all has broken this week. And I think it's a pretty damning indictment of the policing culture in this country. And I think it indicates something about the way in which Black women in particular are dehumanized, objectified, seen as less than. And that could have been something which would have been really powerful for Keir Starmer to speak on, because he wouldn't actually have to even talk about the allocation of funding, would he? Right? If he hasn't worked out where he wants money to go and what his approach to early intervention, whatever it is, that's fine. He's kind of new in the job. But he could have mentioned these two women, the awful treatment of their bodies by police, the fact that their poor mother, after hearing that her two daughters had been brutally slain, to hear what had been done with their bodies by the police. He could have used his voice to lift up that story, and he didn't. Instead, it was going for this really authoritarian line, which is just, it's not just spitting in the face of the Black Lives Matter movement or organization, spitting in the faces of Black people up and down this country.
I think they're all really important points. I mean, as you've heard, our critique of Keir Starmer isn't so much that he didn't say, I want to defund the police, but that it wasn't a particularly respectful answer, I think. Now, I do want to get onto that question, though, whether the left should be demanding that the police are defunded. It has become, I think, the most prominent demand of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. Some people are trying to bring it over to the UK. It hasn't caught on in quite the same way, but it still could. The official Black Lives Matter movement here, their Twitter account is pushing it quite heavily. I'm going to get Aaron and Ash's views on whether we should defund the police in a moment. But first, let's take a look at activist, academic, and former Black Panther Angela Davis explaining how she understands the concept.
The call to defund the police is, I think, an abolitionist demand, but it reflects only one aspect of the process represented by the demand. Defunding the police is not simply about withdrawing funding for law enforcement and doing nothing else. And it appears as if this is the rather superficial understanding that has caused Biden to move in the direction he's moving in. It's about shifting public funds to new services and and new institutions, mental health counselors who can respond to people who are in crisis without arms. It's about shifting funding to education, to housing, to recreation. All of these things help to create security and safety. It's about learning that safety, safeguarded by violence, is not really safety.
I'm going to go to you first, Aaron. After hearing what Angela Davis has said there, do you agree that we should defund the police?
I think in the United States, it's an eminently reasonable demand. I talked about this with Alex Vitale a few weeks ago, and he has written a great book about some of the programs which channel huge amounts of resources, personnel, money into police departments across the United States, anti-terror departments, etc. The American deep state, the Pentagon and so on, the resources they have available to them are just phenomenal. I don't think we have the same issue here in terms of in terms of incarceration. In the United States, every day people are waking up in solitary confinement. 40,000 people every day wake up in solitary confinement in the United States. Almost all of those shouldn't be in solitary confinement. People in solitary confinement, the levels of reoffending are just incredible. If they're in there for life, it's deeply inhumane. You've got, I think, around 6 million people on parole, probation, or in prison in the US. That's more than what was the slave population of the South before the Civil War. It's far more than was ever incarcerated in the gulags of the Soviet Union, far, far more. It's a deeply racialized, authoritarian carceral system in the US. They can defund the police. Here, it's slightly different. Why? Because as Ash has already talked about, we don't have the same resources allocated to policing. At the same time, it's been subject to really profound cuts. When we say cuts, we don't just mean you've got fewer police. We're talking about outsourcing. We're talking about poor pensions, etc. We're talking about the workers' rights of people who serve as police officers. Now, I'm not saying that they are workers as the rest of the labour market, but clearly it's not a leftist demand to say that people who are police officers should have terrible pensions or should have to work to 68. That's not a leftist demand. So I'm not quite sure about it. What I would say, and this is what I think Keir Starmer should have said, is clearly the levels of reoffending we have in this country are so high that they suggest we have a deeply dysfunctional, ineffective, and expensive prison system, criminal justice system in this country. And we should clearly endeavour to change that. A great line from John Edwards, ran for Democratic nominee for president years ago. It's cheaper to send a young man to Yale than to jail. And I think that's correct. We should be using as many resources as possible to educate people, to give them good jobs, good homes, good healthcare, and not lock them up. Because fundamentally, the most powerful resource of any society is our brains. And training people and educating them is always the best return on investment that the taxpayer can have. I don't like to use that kind of vocabulary, but it's inarguably true. And I think that's the kind of rhetoric that Keir Starmer could have couched his answer in.
I mean, I think the point as well is, I think what Keir Starmer could have said is, some of the intuition behind the idea of defunding the police is right, is that we should have other agencies dealing with more issues. And I think the police in this country have started attending more mental health situations, for example. But that doesn't seem to me to be because of a sort of imperial ambition from the UK police force to have their fingers in all of the pies. It seems more like those services were cut and the already cut police had to pick up the pieces, as it were. So I think the argument here is let's defund the police and reallocate the resources and just let's properly fund social services, mental health services, so we don't have to have an unideal organization respond to these kind of problems. Ash, I'm interested if you have any disagreements with me on this one. In a way, I often get in sort of like little Twitter rows on the subject of defunding police or abolition.
Well, look, I'm happy to take over your account whenever you want. But look, I believe in the abolitionist horizon, right? I believe in pursuing the goal of a prisonless, policeless society. But for me, it's a goal, and how you achieve that is by doing two things. Is one, you shift power away from the police. So that would mean getting rid of, I think, drug prohibition laws is a massive one. Just criminalize whole swathes of, minority communities in this country. We de facto have decriminalized drugs for middle class and often white people. You're not likely to be stopped and searched. You don't really have to worry about, your house getting raided in the middle of the night unless you're at a certain level of drugs distribution. But if you're a casual user, you don't have to worry about these things. It's a very, very different story if you're working class, if you're Black, Asian, or minority ethnic. So for me, decriminalizing drugs is a huge way in which you can limit the impact of the criminal justice system as an oppressive force in people's lives. That's one massive thing. The second thing is funding all these other services which reduce the need for police intervention. One is that I would actually limit police powers under the Mental Health Act. The majority of detentions under that act sectioning occurs because of a police intervention, not a medical one. So it would be about limiting that power and also massively funding the mental health care system, also having more psychiatric nurses in the community who can treat and maintain contact with people before the point of having to be detained or sectioned. And I would also like to see, and I know I bang on about this all the time, I would like to see child protection and social services taken seriously in this country, because we only talk about these services when we're talking about extreme cases of violence or neglect, often when a child has tragically died. And we tend to see that conversation taking place in the arena of should this child have been taken into care. Now, obviously, late intervention social work is hugely important. I'm not saying that it isn't. But one of the places where you've seen a drastic decrease in the ability of social workers to deliver services is in early intervention social work. So often that's doing stuff like supporting people to be better parents. When you've got a struggling mum who herself might be, second generation through the care system, she's got young kids, she's struggling to keep up, she's struggling with money, it's having social workers who can come in and help stabilize that situation. That's exactly the kind of work where, because of budget cuts, and these cuts have affected the poorest local authorities sometimes at 6 times the rate of budget cuts for richer areas. You have an increase in caseload, fewer frontline staff, and families are falling through the cracks. And I think that's a massive way in which you can deal with cycles of violence in our society. And the third thing that I would like to see, and that's my version of decriminalizing drugs, it absolutely doesn't ignore the huge harm drug dealing and problematic use of psychoactive substances have had in this country. I just don't think you deal with those issues by criminalizing drugs. But one of the things that you also have to do is invest in communities to make them more resilient to really exploitative and horrible gangs. One of the reasons why county lines drug dealing has taken off in the way that it has really in the last decade or so is because we've just had money stripped out of deprived and vulnerable communities because of austerity. So that means fewer support services, families having to do, more with less in terms of their welfare being cut. You've got, declining, standards in schools in terms of increasing class sizes. You've got things like Sure Start being cut, etc., etc. And it just means that communities are less resilient when you've got, really violent gangs coming in who are also showing, one of the only ways in which you might be able to make some money. So for me, it's about doing two things at once. You take powers away from the police and you put funding and you put resources into communities who need it. And I think that you end up with a journey towards a society where the need for these institutions withers away. Oh, and on the final point, sorry, I know I'm whispering on about this, but it is something I feel really strongly about, is we've got one of the worst recidivism rates, i.e. reoffending rates in Western Europe. We've got nearly a 40% reoffending rate within 12 months of someone's custodial sentence coming to an end. We've got recidivism rates of 75% over the course of 9 years. So that tells you that there's something really, really wrong with how we do criminal justice in this society, because we're not doing rehabilitation, but we are doing punishment. We're not helping people put their lives back together in a way which is sustainable, but we are tarring them with a brush which is going to make it much harder for them to get jobs, settle down, and rebuild their lives again. So what we have isn't working. And just by building more prisons, we're not necessarily mitigating the demand, we're exacerbating it. We're only going to hasten that kind of, schools to prison, care to prison, youth offending centre to prison pipeline that we've got in this country. So it's a different story because of austerity. We don't have the same hugely inflated police budgets that as you see in the US. Our prison system, the Ministry of Justice has had the deepest cuts of any Whitehall department. But it is the case that we have completely wonky funding. What's the word I'm looking for? Priorities, completely wonky. And we're kind of feeding the same monster that we're hoping to defeat by saying the solution to this is more cops, more prisons.
I mean, I suppose I agree with all of those practical suggestions. Where I sort of demur is on this question of whether it's helpful at all to talk about abolitionist horizons. Because for me, it's sort of like, I feel like that's when lots of people switch off, but I also feel like they maybe switch off for a reason, as in like, it's not just let's have better optics and stop talking about abolition. I'm not really sure what abolishing the police or abolishing prisons would look like. I'm not really in favor of classifying everything as a mental health problem, because I think that could end up being, almost more sinister than saying you've broken the rule, you have to do the time, is to sort of say you've broken a rule, now we have to sort of treat you as a patient. I don't really like that. And this idea of not having a police force where there's a sort of division of labor, where there's some rules laid out and these guys are the people who are supposed to respond to them as a last resort. I mean, I can't see a society where, a modern industrialized society where that really works. I mean, what am I missing, Ash?
Well, one of the things that I would say is what we tend to think of as violent crime is a really specific kind of violent crime. And a really good example of this is knife crime. So when we had the news stories around stabbings just going round and round and round in the news, the focus was, for very good reason, working class, usually black kids in urban settings, right? That's the story. But a bladed weapon is used in, I think, almost half of domestic violence murders, and yet we don't understand that kind of crime as being part of the knife crime moral panic, right? We tend to imagine violent crime as something which can happen at random in the street. Don't think about what goes on in people's homes. Now, I'm not saying the way in which you deal with that is go, all right, no cops in people's homes, no cops for domestic violence calls. No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that we have an organization of society in which violence is reproduced through not just the institutions of state, but the institutions which make up our daily lives and our most intimate settings as well. So I think that there's a lot that we can do about the organization of a society which produces this kind of violence. I don't think that it's merely all just a kind of pathology that exists within people and has to be dealt with only by the state. I think we can actually change some of the pillars of our culture and reduce this threat of violent crime, not necessarily to zero. I don't think that will necessarily ever be possible, but I think we could reduce it by enough to severely mitigate the role for police in our day-to-day lives.
Aaron, do you have abolitionist horizons?
I'm not an abolitionist. No, I agree with you. It probably obscures and mystifies more than it clarifies. I think as few people as possible should be in the police. I think as few people as possible should be subject to any kind of arbitrary detention. In practical terms, I can tell you what that looks like. Do I want to put a name on some sort of eschatological plane about what this new world will be? I mean, not really. I mean, I can see a world where we reduce prison populations by 90%, sure. I can see a world where we reduce, the numbers of police by 50%. Sure, I can see that massively. We talk about recidivism, reoffending rates in Norway. I think it's something like 30%. Now, it's much lower in Norway, not just because they have rehabilitation and nice prisons, also because it's a more equal society. Also because, opportunities, if you're in a full-time job, you generally have, almost universally have a good standard of living. That's not the case here. If you're a 17, 18-year-old kid in London and you've lost EMA 10 years ago, you're losing free public transport as a result of recent cuts in London, all of a sudden, things are really tough, right? Things are really, really tough. And Ash is very right about this. If somebody's coming along with a better alternative, and by the way, pretty much everything looks like a better alternative right now to being an apprentice, or to being on minimum wage if you're under 18 in London, none of it works. That doesn't work. Crime pays in that context. And so I think Keir Starmer's a mile off in his analysis here. And what we need to say to people is, well, if Keir Starmer thinks that BLM saying this is ridiculous, what does he think about decriminalizing marijuana? Does he think that's ridiculous? It's legal in several American states. What does he think about saying, well, the police are a necessary evil? That was never a socialist position. That was a classical liberal position. The state is a necessary evil. The police are a necessary evil. They can restrict your rights to the extent where it's in your own rational self-interest. This is 250 years of liberal political theory. Now, I'm not saying John Locke's a great guy. Yeah, I know, African, Royal African Company, etc., slave owners. I get it. But the ideology that was saying was that actually the constraints imposed upon you by the state should not be extensive. And Keir Starmer's clearly a deviation from that. And that's a surprise because, yes, Keir Starmer's not a socialist, but I did think he was a social liberal, especially with his legal background. What this tells us today is he might not be. And that's really worrying. If we have an authoritarian who doesn't have a particularly radical vision on the economy, even in the context of coronavirus, yeah, he does begin to look like a Tony Blair Mark II. And even I have said he's not Tony Blair. By the way, I don't think he is Tony Blair. I think he's to the left of Tony Blair. But this response has surprised me because if he's not a social liberal, one of the most pernicious aspects of the new Labour regime was just how authoritarian and socially conservative they were on things like prisons, on things like drugs. It would be terrible if Keir Starmer was to go down the same path.
We're going to get up the tweet that I sort of joked about at the start of this show, which is Nigel Farage approvingly quoting or quote tweeting the clip that we showed first on this show. Can we get this up? So he says, heartily agree with Keir Starmer's condemnation of the Black Lives Matter organization. This was, widely, again, people quote tweeting Nigel Farage saying, well done, Keir Starmer. You've managed to have a position that even Nigel Farage finds acceptable. I sometimes find the argument of sort of, criticizing someone because of someone who's opportunistically agreed with them a little bit cheap. I think didn't David Duke agree with Corbyn at some point? It's completely ridiculous. But I don't know. There are other nuanced takes. What did you make of this, Ash?
Well, I think that Nigel Farage knows what he's doing. He knows that by endorsing Keir Starmer's comments, he's going to kick off a massive row amongst progressives and the left. And it forces Keir Starmer into a position where either he stands by his original comments and by extension, Nigel Farage's reading of those comments, or he rose back and explains himself and he looks weaker for it. So I think that this is a canny bit of politicking rather than a genuine endorsement. And you've seen it with figures on the far right many different times. So the thing about Nick Griffin and David Duke endorsing Jeremy Corbyn, it's a way of delegitimizing the left. Nigel Farage, he's really good at this kind of quite manipulative political strategy. So I think that that's what his intention is, rather than him actually seeing something in it which is, he approves of. However, it's an opportunity which is of Keir Starmer's own making. And it's because of that incredibly disrespectful tone he took when he was talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and the political demand of defunding. This comes back to my point about what is it he's trying to do and who is he speaking to and for what purpose. None of us here, including me, who would describe themselves as an abolitionist, thinks that Keir Starmer should have said, I'm actually an abolitionist. By the way, have you read Angela Davis's new book? It's fucking brilliant. That's not who he is. He's constrained by his kind of avowed mission statement of win back the votes of socially conservative older voters in the North and the Midlands of England, right? And he doesn't want to rock that boat too much. But what he can do is bring people together by making a case for progressive values, which is amenable to a pretty significant chunk of the population. And it didn't have to be defunding if that's not what he's comfortable saying. It could have simply been about what he would want to fund instead. It could have been about the recommendations made by David Lammy in the Lammy report. And you know what? That would have been really appropriate because David Lammy is the Shadow Justice Secretary. He didn't do any of that. Instead, he leant so far into this really authoritarian. And like I said, it's not just that it's authoritarian. It's not just the politics of it. It's also about the mood of it. This kind of pride in having no truck and being instantly dismissive and having very little political curiosity, because he thinks that that's what speaks to that part of the electoral coalition that he wants to put together. I actually think that people respect you when you try and have a serious conversation, when you lay out where you are and why and where it is you want to take them. And he missed that opportunity. And that is a very risky thing because you don't get anywhere in left-wing politics. And when I say left-wing politics, I merely mean to the left of the Tory party in this country. I'm not even talking about being an avowed socialist, but you don't get anywhere if you decide that you're not even going to try to persuade people. You're not going to get anywhere if you only pick fights that you think already have a chance of success and you just need to attach your name to it to tip it over. Because that's not how you do anti-racism in an age of reaction. That's not even how you do it during the good times, but it's certainly not how you do it now.
Can I also add one more thing?
Yep.
I mean, we're in a context where the Labour leader is more likely to call his own party members and colleagues racists than members of the Metropolitan Police Service. It's a very, very strange moment. We're in a context where the shadow foreign secretary is more likely to call party members of Labour racist than Donald Trump. And again, it expresses the profound issues there are now within Labour. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was an expression of it, but fundamentally, the party's membership and its base is its voters even are significantly to the left of its MPs. And when I say of its MPs, I mean their instincts. And you even saw this in effect with some of the Remain stuff. You saw people like Keir Starmer go, oh yeah, let's... And by the way, this is really revealing, isn't it? Keir Starmer now, like Ash has just said, is sort of chasing these potentially red Tory, blue Labour votes in what was previously red wall seats, which is fine. You know, it's explicable as an electoral strategy. I get it. But this is the same guy who was saying we have to campaign for a second referendum and will campaign for Remain in that second referendum 2 years ago. So what happened to this socially liberal man who was saying that as good internationalists, we have to stay in the European Union, despite any referendum with a majority of 1.5 million people saying that we should leave? He's gone from that sort of uber London social liberal zealot to this other almost a parody of like Ash said, a kind of dismissive white middle class lawyer. Oh, this is just ridiculous. I'm not going to talk about it. Very concerning. Again, it probably tells us the man's quite opportunistic. You know, you say, oh, Aaron's bringing sort of personal beefs. How else do you explain it? The guy's gone from being the figurehead of hashtag FBPE to somebody getting an endorsement from Nigel Farage. Now, we've said this is a kind of cheap shot. It's true. People have said, oh, Marine Le Pen has said Corbyn was good. Well, Marine Le Pen also thinks there should be public ownership of energy and water. Just because she thinks that doesn't mean I no longer agree with that idea. But I do think it's important because what Nigel Farage has done is try to insert himself within the present moment around BLM, try to delegitimize it. And I do think he is genuinely happy that the Labour leader has said what he has said, which is that their demands are nonsense and to diminish them and to demean them. I do think he means that when he's saying on Twitter that he's happy Keir Starmer is on the same side as him.
We're going to go on to our next section, which again is sort of an event that happened in Keir Starmer's morning media round. First of all, we have a tweet on the hashtag Tisky Sour from Christopher Bowles. Ash speaks the truth. The aspects of underfunding of community services and low-paid work in those same areas means children are left vulnerable to the influence of gangs. And Guna Burns with a £10 super chat. Thank you for that. Says, hey guys, any chance of a show interview on electoral reform at some point soon? Keep up the good work. I'm sure we can manage that, Guna. I suppose Guna's probably
wrong football team. Wrong football team.
Next story. On his media round this morning, Keir Starmer was also grilled on his attitude towards trans rights. The topic came up because of a controversy involving the MP Lloyd, Russell-Moyle and J.K. Rowling. We'll go into that in a bit more detail in a moment. First, let's take a look at Keir Starmer answering a question on whether he thinks that trans rights are ever in conflict with women's rights.
What I've said in this, because it is a sensitive issue, trans rights are human rights. The legislation we've got doesn't go far enough. We ought to have a cross-party consensus about looking at it to see whether it can be developed. But what concerns me here is that this whole issue has become a political football. There must be a space for a mature discussion about how we improve the rights of the trans community, obviously preserve, safe spaces. I'm very, very conscious of the experience of women that have gone through sexual assault, sexual violence. I think we need to respect the right to self-identify, but we need to look at the framework that goes around that. That's where the legislation needs to take place. That's where the broad discussion needs to take place. And I really don't want to get drawn into doing exactly the opposite of what I'm suggesting here, which is treating it as a political football. It's complicated, it's sensitive. I don't think that sort of hurling things at each other is the way forward.
So again, I mean, it's clear what's going on. Keir Starmer has recognised that reform of the Gender Recognition Act is a divisive topic. The Tories seem somewhat desperate to use it as a means to split Labour's electoral base or its potential electoral base. And Keir Starmer has decided, in light of that, to sort of take a step back. So we're going to try and, remove, as he says, politics from this and try and have a technocratic discussion, basically, about reform to how we or how people get a birth certificate of a different gender. Ash, I'll go to you first. There is lots of people, on Twitter today who seemed upset that Keir Starmer wasn't more clearly picking a side in this debate. What do you make of it?
I actually think it's a smart move to try and bring it back down to the issue of concrete policy. And the reason why I've come to this view is through our wonderful interview with Sean Fay a little while ago. The thing that Sean was saying is that we've turned this into almost like a referendum on the metaphysics of gender, whereas actually what was at stake with the amendments to the Gender Recognition Act was simply to get rid of the medical gatekeeping involved in trans people being able to obtain a gender recognition certificate and change the gender bit on their birth certificate. And when Sean explained it like that to me, it was really, really clear. It wasn't about how do I think of gender? How does she think of gender? How does my mum think about gender? What's my relationship like to my own womb? Really, it was about privacy, the rights of the individual, and the kind of obstacles the state has put in the way, which get in between someone's happiness and the life that they're currently living. So for me, actually taking the heat out of it is a really, really good thing. What I reject, however, is the narrative which pits women against transgender people. Because one, trans women are women. It doesn't matter that they have a different experience of womanhood to me, because it's not like I've got the same experience of womanhood as a white woman does. It doesn't make either one of us more or less women than each other. It just means that our lives have been shaped by really different experiences. But I also reject the framing because it invites us to think of transgender people, and let's be real about this, predominantly transgender women, as being predatory, as being threatening, as being somehow perverted or deviant. And that's why it always comes back to these spaces of toilets and of changing rooms and kind of enclosed public/private spaces. And it's the same narratives which were often used in the 1980s when it came to gay people, and in particular gay men. There were all of these moral panics about whether or not you could trust a gay man in the same changing room as you, or a gay man to be a Scouts leader, because obviously they were predatory. Now, we all know that there is a tiny, tiny minority of trans people who are predatory. There is a tiny minority of cisgender women who are predatory. But that wouldn't mean that we would advocate banning, say, lesbians from women's changing rooms, or, gay men from, men's public toilets, right? That would be a horrendously discriminatory approach to safeguarding these spaces in which people are perhaps exposed to a bit more risk to one another. You look at those spaces and you think about the appropriate safeguards that you need. Now, coming back to this issue of trans access to single-sex spaces, to me it seems wholly obvious that you work on the specific safeguards that space needs, rather than discriminating against an already marginalized community who have to navigate discrimination and harassment in their everyday lives.
I mean, I kind of disagreed with the people on Twitter who thought that Keir Starmer was doing a terrible thing here, and partly, I mean, I totally agree with you that the heat needs to be taken out of this particular debate. And I do think that whilst, I mean, having experience of both sides, there is only one side who are complete bullies and shouting at trans women penis. Like I was actually an event with that you were speaking at, Ash, where I was first sort of, came across how hostile and horrible people who are against trans rights can be. But at the same time, I do think that, the campaign for reform of the Gender Recognition Act hasn't really been helped by people who say any suggestion that there could possibly be any problem whatsoever with self-identification is a transphobe or is dog whistling. So I do think, it's before you've won an argument, you have to let people have a debate. And people often go back to the argument about gay rights. People, when they were fighting for gay rights, you made a lot of arguments. We were born this way. This is love, etc., etc. You couldn't just say, if you're questioning the rights of gay people to do whatever, you should be excluded from the conversation, because that's not how reform in that situation was won. So I can understand Keir Starmer's sort of idea to say, let's take a step back and try doing this somewhat differently.
I mean, look, the one thing I would say about that is that obviously if you want to not just achieve technical legislative change. You also want to achieve cultural change. Obviously, you've got to have the same argument again and again and again and again and again, because that's how you change people's minds about stuff. I also know from experience that that can be exhausting, and I understand people's impatience with it and not wanting to have to debate the legitimacy of your humanity with people who fundamentally don't recognize that. So I understand that exhaustion. However, I'm in agreement that you do actually have to make the case, and you do have to explain these things to people. And I'll give an example actually of someone who came a really long way on this issue of trans rights. It was less to do with single sex spaces and more to do with things like puberty blockers and access to transitioning treatments during adolescence or even before adolescence. And it was my mum. So she was coming at it from a child protection angle because she works in child protection. And so she was very not cool with the idea of puberty blockers. She was really worried about, she didn't really understand how being trans was different from something like being a drag queen. And she was worried about, the kind of more, lewd elements of that bit of nightlife culture being something which was kind of being exposed to children. And that was her starting point. And then and it wasn't even me giving her a hard time, although I did that too. It was just from kind of years of listening to the experiences of trans people, also having to work with trans youth in her role as a social worker. She's now come around to the idea of actually you need to expand these treatments. You need to make it really easy for children and their parents to access them. You really need to also support parents in supporting their kids when it comes to, going through the transition process. And you need to have these conversations openly, honestly, and without shame. And she's of that generation who, when left to, mum's net and, that bit of the internet, can become quite radicalized. And that tells me that there's value in having these conversations. And there's value in trying to shift where people are. And you can do it kindly, and you can do it, with affection and honesty and all the rest of it. And you can bring people along with you. That's something which gives me a bit of hope.
Aaron, I'm going to go to you in one moment. First of all, I just said in the intro that I was going to introduce the sort of Lloyd Russell-Moyle, J.K. Rowling element of the controversy, which is why Keir Starmer was asked about it this morning. So to introduce you to that, you probably saw it went completely viral on Twitter. J.K. Rowling wrote a blog post where she was sort of explaining why she was against self-identification. I've read some very convincing threads saying that many of the arguments made in it weren't quite as based in fact as she liked to get across, but in it she also introduced the fact that she herself was a survivor of sexual abuse. Lloyd Russell-Moyle, sort of in an argument about, or in an article for Tribune about why the Labour Party should be standing up more proactively for trans rights, included this passage. So can we get this up? So recently, of course, we saw people like J.K. Rowling using her own sexual assault as justification for discriminating against a group of people who were not responsible for it. Trans people are no more likely to be rapists. In fact, they are more likely to be victims of sexual assault. That's why, despite J.K. Rowling's hate towards them, hundreds of trans people wrote to complain to The Sun when it trivialized her domestic abuse on a recent front page. This got picked up by the Daily Mail, or the Mail on Sunday, I think, in fact, who went with this headline: Labour frontbencher Lloyd Russell-Moyle makes grovelling apology for accusing Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling of exploiting her sexual assault ordeal to score political points in transgender row. I suppose actually that's presumably the second article that was on it, because the first article was saying he'd done this. The apology didn't come until after that. Lloyd Russell-Moyle has since apologised. Aaron, do you want to come in on that particular point, or whatever we were talking about before, the broader issues?
Yeah, a few things. So, in these debates, first of all, single sex spaces and so on, this is covered by the 2010 Equality Act. This is not the GRA. So a lot of the people that are saying, they're talking about legislation we already have. They're talking about legislation that Labour implemented. Any Labour MP that's not willing to defend one of the better legacies of the Brown government, well, I feel sorry for you. You should be able to at least do that as a Labour MP, whatever part of the party you're from. So that's the first part. Secondly, the GRA, the government's clearly not, they're going to try and spike big parts of this. But I think they'd be very brave to try and roll back the Equality Act. And I think that's what Starmer's trying to prepare us for here. But on a basic kind of, and I think, Labour are clearly going to go to bat for that. And I also believe, by the way, that Keir Starmer, when he says trans rights are human rights, he means that. I do believe that. People are saying, oh, this is about, the left has to ditch identity politics. This is about civil liberties. This is about equality under the law. This is like, 400-500-year-old stuff. The left shouldn't just dispense with that frivolity and just focus on wages and forget about civil liberties. Right to trial, pathetic. Right to the presence of a lawyer if you're arrested, ridiculous. Equality under the law, it'll never last. Well, it's probably something we should try and preserve. Then you've got to look at the kind of, how would this be enforced? Are we going to have people inspecting people's genitalia at changing rooms? Oh, I think actually you were born, I'm going to check. How's that going to work? Secondly, you've got cis women who are lesbians who are being accused of being trans women. So that's a way of rolling back the clock. I've heard many examples of this, of rolling back the clock towards homophobia. Then thirdly, I've seen so many times cis women who are allies of trans women being harassed and bullied by TERFs. So again, to what extent, how far does your idea of the sisterhood go if that's how you're treating cis women? And then another sort of substantive point to that is, and I've seen this again so many times, apparently trans women aren't really women, but trans men are men, right? So you have a trans man sticking up for trans women, and they'll say, well, this is misogynistic. Well, hold on. You're saying that a trans woman isn't really a woman, but a trans man is a man. I mean, the levels of inconsistency and ineptitude and stupidity to all these arguments, are brazen. And I think that's why you're both incredibly, on the money to say that we need to take this down, have a smart conversation, talk about the facts, and talk about this in a measured way. And I think the more we do that, actually, the more in the interests of trans people that is. In terms of Lloyd Russell-Moyle's comments, what J.K. Rowling said was that trans rights are giving cover, I can't remember the exact words, something like cover like never before to predators. So basically she's saying the discourse of trans rights is giving carte blanche to predators. That is categorically untrue. It is abusive to a minority of the population who's subject to incredible prejudice. I thought it was a sickening thing to say. I thought what Lord Russell-Moyle wrote, unwise for a member of the shadow cabinet to write. But what I thought, I don't think she should be off the hook for saying that. Because trans women, trans men are subject to all manners of violence, structural violence, but also personal violence in relationships. And I thought it was a really horrific thing to say. Actually, it's one of the most horrific things I think that's been said by anyone in this whole conversation. And she seems to be getting a free pass from many people because she's written some quite popular children's books.
Ash, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, so I do want to come in on this because I think what Lloyd Russell-Moyle wrote, it got a lot of backlash, but the clumsy thing that he was trying to gesture at is, okay, look, like so many women out there, I myself have been sexually assaulted. It's all too common, and it's something which I've lost count of the number of women I know who've been in similar situations. And every one of those women has been assaulted by a cisgender man. I don't look at a trans woman and see someone who is likely to hurt me. I don't think about how they may have been assigned at birth or any of those things. I look at someone and I see someone who's likely to have experienced many of the same things as me, perhaps things like domestic violence as well, and actually has far less access to the services needed to seek help, get out of violent situations, and keep themselves safe. The thing that I, as a cisgender woman who has experienced sexual violence, and a transgender woman who has experienced sexual violence probably have in common is that it was a cisgender man who did it. And I don't see how it benefits anybody, least of all, actually, survivors of gendered violence, to identify and pick on one of the most marginalized communities in our society and say, you're the real threat here. And that's where I felt that aspect of what J.K. Rowling had said, it actually was really awful, because in the way that that piece was put together, it implied that trans women can only ever be perceived as a threat by cisgender women who've experienced sexual violence or domestic violence. And that's really not the case at all. Like with any community, there's a minority of trans people who are predators. There are a minority of cisgender women who are predators. There are that cuts across pretty much every identity bracket. And the thing that we've got to start realizing that these predators have in common is that they're predators, nothing else.
I think that's a very powerful note to end that particular segment on. Very important intervention there, Ash. We are going to finish on another sensitive topic. Oh, we've been doing all of them tonight. And it is about a tweet that Black Lives Matter UK sent on Sunday, which got a lot of retweets, but also caused quite a lot of controversy. So let's get the tweet up first before we look at some of the complaints that were made about it. So Black Lives Matter UK says, as Israel moves forward with the annexation of the West Bank and mainstream British politics is gagged of the right to critique Zionism and Israel's settler colonial pursuits, we loudly and clearly stand beside our Palestinian comrades. Free Palestine. Now that tweet was critiqued for supposedly adopting an anti-Semitic trope. And actually, instead of explaining it to you, I'm going to get straight up a critique of that tweet from Matt Lucas. Can we get this up? So Matt Lucas says, mainstream politics gagged of the right to critique Zionism by wheeling out the anti-Semitic Jews control everything trope. The individual who wrote the tweet below does the BLM movement and those like myself who are committed to change and growth a great disservice. To be honest, maybe I shouldn't have brought Matt Lucas in so soon because he is a ridiculous argument. There are people who are less ridiculous than Matt Lucas who had a problem with that tweet. But yeah, in general, I mean, what did you make of the initial tweet, I suppose, first? I'll go, Ash.
Oh, what did I make of the initial tweet? Okay, look, we know that there are heightened tensions around talking about Israel, and in particular, when you talk specifically about Zionism. Now, it is true that there are cases where people who talk about Zionism, they're using it as a stand-in for all Jewish people. They're using it as a way to talk about conspiracy theories and things which are unequivocally anti-Semitic. But the word which seems to have caused the most outcry here is gagged. Right? The idea that people are gagged from criticizing Zionism. And this is where it's not just all conspiracy theories. You do have cases where you have young people, school-age people, who've been referred to prevent because they've expressed support for BDS. You do have cases where IHRA is invoked to say that BDS, or indeed promoting, say, a one-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, is itself anti-Semitic. And you do have cases like Boris Johnson saying that public bodies, including universities, should be banned from supporting BDS. Now, that to me looks like a pretty serious set of policies and measures which impinge upon people's freedom of expression when it comes to discussing Israel and Palestine. I'm not going to say, because I do not believe it to be the case, that it's the fault of the Jewish diaspora in this country. And I don't believe it's the fault of, a shadowy Israel lobby. Lots of countries have lobbyists. Saudi Arabia has lobbyists. India has lobbyists. Turkey has lobbyists. It's not the case that I think that there's some kind of, shadowy cabal operating behind the scenes to get this stuff done. But I do think that our conversation about Israel and Palestine has, over the last decade in particular, really slid to the right. And what's become the boundaries of acceptable opinion has aligned further and further and further in a very, right-wing, expansionist Israeli government's favor. And I think we should be able to identify that and criticize it, and not just criticize it within this kind of abstract, airy-fairy realm of opinion. We should also be able to take action on it. And that does mean supporting boycott, divestment, and sanctions. That does mean supporting the Palestinian cause and identifying issues which are affecting Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip every single day. And it does mean pushing, vehicles for progressive political means, whether that's party politics or activist organizations we might be a part of, to condemn plans for annexation later this summer. So I know that's a really long way to talk about the tweet, but I think it's important to try and get these things right, particularly where there's so much, I think, mutual mistrust between different communities who experience racism.
I'm going to get Matt Lucas back up before I go to you, Aaron, because I know you're going to have loads to say about it. Can we get this up? Mainstream British politics is gagged of the right to critique Zionism by wheeling out the anti-Semitic Jews control everything trope. The individual who wrote the tweet below does the BLM movement and those like myself who are committed to change and growth a great disservice. Ash, what do you make of... Sorry, not Ash. Aaron, what do you make of Matt Lucas's intervention?
I mean, somehow a white comedian who I think went to Oxbridge, who significant part of his comedian his comedy routine was to dress up as a giant baby or do blackface. Somehow he's made BLM about him and about his, my growth, my journey. It's not about your journey. It's about black people not being killed by the police and them having more or less the same experience at the hands of the police that you do as a white guy. It just stinks of how ignorant and how ill-informed these people are. And as Ash has said, over the last 10 years, this whole conversation has just moved massively to the right. If you say that, Israel is a settler colonial state, oh my God, that's anti-Semitic. Look, this was something was openly said by the founding creators of Israel. People say this, we're a settler colonial state. We deserve to be here. Here's why. Part of our national. If you say the word Zionism, oh my God, he said Zionism. This was the nationalist ideology. Nationalist ideologies were pretty pervasive towards the end of the 19th century in Europe, if you didn't know. And that's what it was called. And it has very specific elements to it because unlike most or nearly all nationalist ideologies, it was premised upon the exclusion and displacement of an indigenous population. There are many other settler colonial states. You could talk about the Americas, Australia, etc. But Israel is relatively unique. So would I have written gagged? If you've got a master's in political communications, no, you'd be wise not to do that. It may, some people may interpret it in a certain way, but the idea that because somebody has used the word gag, that they're racist. I mean, we don't hold anybody to this same standard. It's absurd. So if it was in the context of somebody saying something previously, which was, dodgy, maybe I could understand it. But that's simply not the case. And furthermore, as you've both highlighted, there's good reason to say what they've said. It's true. There's a significant amount of not just political but also legal pushback around solidarity towards Palestinian people. And it's not just here in the UK. You see it in the US as well. So I thought it was a very strange response, but also very revealing. And what's interesting is these apparently well-educated, affluent white celebrities, it turns out when it comes to these issues around geopolitics, around history, including their own history in Britain, they know the least.
I mean, I probably should have pointed out that I think Matt Lucas himself is Jewish. The thing I thought was particularly strange about that tweet, so, he does have some right to talk about these things. The thing I found strange about that tweet was the idea that he's saying, it does a disservice to people like me who have grown from this movement. And so he now thinks he has some particular privilege to speak about the Black Lives Matter movement because 2 weeks ago he agreed to have him doing blackface a decade ago taken off iPlayer. It's almost like the Black Lives Matter movement should be grateful to Matt Lucas and should try and say things which make him feel comfortable so that he doesn't readorn blackface and demand that the BBC re-upload the image of him pretending to be a lazy black woman in a shop.
If you don't behave, I'm going to black up again. And
exactly.
It's going to be all your fault.
Can I come in on this?
Go on.
Look, I'm mixed heritage. I'm half Iranian. I would never, ever deem to speak on behalf of Black Lives Matter like Matt Lucas or like Keir Starmer we talked about earlier on. It's crazy. I'm pretty white passing. And Ash is a beautiful South Asian. She's very dark. And she's actually, she's racialized as black by many, many people. But we have to be serious. And this is about the whole category of BAME. It's a really, the category of BAME, how they're policed, how they're racialized by society, their structural experience, the economy in America, but also here too, is really specific. And there's a worrying slippage where, okay, he's Jewish, but the guy's white passing. Let's be real. I would categorize myself as white passing. He's definitely white passing. There's a worrying elision when you start to say that I'm also part of this category of, the people oppressed under the label of BLM. Very worrying, very worrying. And it's a a potentially dangerous way of subverting its core political principles, I think.
I mean, I do think that here's something where I feel that I'm still cooking, right? I'm still learning. I'm still developing my thoughts on this. So this is very much a kind of work in progress. But I do think that we're at this moment where our ability to coalesce anti-racist movement in many ways is more inhibited than ever. I think that it's really because 40 years of neoliberalism has really hurt us. That old colonial game of divide and rule, it's been taking place right here in the metropole, and you do have different communities being played off against one another. And I think that when it comes to, and this is something which is quite specific to the UK, and I think it's because of the way in which the anti-Semitism issue was seen as a Corbyn specific and a left specific issue, it means that you've got completely wild blind spots. So you do have people of color who, because anti-Semitism in this country at this particular moment in history doesn't take the form of police violence or being thought of as a terrorist, it's not really about exposure to state violence, right? It's not going to dictate whether or not you're going to be stopped and searched. It's not going to dictate what kind of housing you get, or are you going to be able to get that job interview, who have found it really difficult to consider anti-Semitism a form of racism the same way as anti-blackness or the same way as Islamophobia. And I think it's difficult, and it's certainly something which I've had to understand, and I've had to understand as a friend of mine put it to me, that anti-Semitism is cyclical. So it's not something which you can necessarily trace as a kind of linear progression through colonialism or slavery. It's cyclical. So at those moments in history where Jewish people have felt some ways at their most safest and most welcome in society, the rug just gets pulled out from under your feet. And that's the history of pogroms. That's the history of anti-Semitism. That's something which I've had to learn, right? And something which I don't think I fully appreciated until more recently than I would care to admit. And on the other side of this, you do have these figures like Matt Lucas, who was, blacking up until 10 years ago. David Baddiel with his history of blackface in the 1990s. Many others who consider themselves part of, the kind of community leadership, who are deeply invested in the continuing dispossession of Palestinian people, or themselves have got, they're really up to their necks when it comes to Islamophobia, is that you have, it's more than just a blind spot, a kind of willing participation in the racist and racialized oppression of people of color. And that's another thing which makes it really difficult to think about what some kind of coordinated anti-racist movement or language that we can share. And I think that it would be terrible for us to give up on this idea. It's also crap of us to assume that it's easy, and it's going to take so much, I think, digging and self-examination, like on all sides. But it's urgent. It's so urgent. And one of the issues, I think, with anti-Semitism having been cast as a uniquely left-wing issue. Now, of course, there's anti-Semitism on the left. There's Islamophobia on the left. There's anti-blackness on the left. But with it being considered a uniquely left-wing issue, is that we've somehow deadened our sensitivity to the rise of an anti-Semitism which connects Jewish people to, Black Lives Matter and to, immigration into the West, and says that actually the fact that you can see so many Muslims who you don't like, it's a Jewish conspiracy, or, George Soros is funding Black Lives Matter and is paying for all these protesters. We've somehow... we don't register it because it's not coming from Jeremy Corbyn, or because it's not specifically to do with Israel and with Palestine. And it's dangerous, I think. And it's exactly that kind of ideology which led to, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. It's something which completely infects alt-right thinking. So I think the need for developing some kind of shared language and shared experience is so urgent. And yeah, my very work in progress thought is that I think it also takes some humility and some honesty about the places where we're coming from and the kind of assumptions that have been baked in.
Yeah, I think it's. I just want to introduce a little bit of context in terms of, because I know that we showed the critique from Matt Lucas, and there were more, good faith critiques. I did invite a couple of people on who'd made good faith critiques publicly, but they couldn't make it, unfortunately. But I suppose the two problems with the tweet is one, the timing. So the idea that, well, the timing seems related to the Rebecca Long Bailey story, which actually wasn't about people not being able to talk about Zionism, right? It was about someone saying something that wasn't true, connecting George Floyd to Israel. So, it can be problematic when you bring up this particular issue at a moment which is somewhat unrelated. And the other, as you say, Aaron, is this word gagged, which people have objected to, and potentially should avoid words like that. I don't have particularly strong feelings on that. But what I do think is important that we should really defend is this right for movements to connect to one another. Because what we have seen this weekend is people saying the Black Lives Matter movement shouldn't have an opinion on Israel-Palestine, right? But the fact that you have cross-national solidarity between oppressed groups, that's as old as time memorial. And so if the Black Lives Matter movement want to express their solidarity with the Palestinian movement, they have every right to, and in fact, it's the right thing to do, even if it does make some people uncomfortable. So yes, be careful with your language, be careful with what particular connections you're making and whether they're appropriate or not. But no one should feel, ashamed or worried because they want to connect really important and connected struggles.
When Gil Scott Heron sang Johannesburg, right? And brilliant bit of it, which is LA is Johannesburg, London's like Johannesburg, New York's like Johannesburg. It was drawing connections between the experience of Black people in America and the continuation of apartheid South Africa. No one said that was a distraction.
Aaron, I'm going to give you the final point, and then we're going to end. We're going to wrap up.
Yeah, one of the points of the IHRA, which I do agree with, is that there's a problem if you ever sort of conflate Jewish people with Israel. That's a very concerning thing for somebody to do. Many people do it by habit. We should try and teach them out of it, But what's happened with Keir Starmer and Matt Lucas is they've done precisely that. So, Maxine Peake made a comment in regards to Minneapolis and Israeli security services, which was factually inaccurate. The word Jewish was never mentioned. And Matt Lucas has done the same thing here in regards to a tweet which is talking about Israel and Zionism. Now, if I meet a British Jew, they're British. That's how maybe it's because I'm a British Iranian. That's just how I see them, because I'm mixed race. I don't think in those terms, and I think it's really worrying when, if you were to conflate Jewish people in Israel on one side of the debate, you could be expelled from the Labour Party, and yet on the other side of the debate, you've got the Labour Party leader doing it. It's really concerning, and I think it does speak to profound bad faith going on in many of these debates, particularly on the left, particularly within the Labour Party, which, like Ash says, is looking at the membership as uniquely in hock to these terrible prejudices. Let's be frank. The people who are going to prison, the people who are plotting terrorist offences, frankly, are white nationalists. You really don't have to look very far for white supremacy on the internet, which, by the way, is some of the cultures around this stuff are growing to an extraordinary extent around white supremacy. All manner of kind of gateways into it, Norse mythology, etc., bodybuilding and so on. I'm not hating on bodybuilders. Anybody that knows my work knows I would never do that. But and you think, wow, this is becoming a really big subculture.
I love the idea that for Aaron, the B in BAME stands for bodybuilders.
Yeah. This is becoming a really big subculture, and you're worried about Black Lives Matter using the word gagged. Like, are you serious? Really? With all the problems that we're confronting right now in multicultural societies? So it's concerning. I mean, I think you have to be patient, but it's also a bit dunderheaded to think that's the biggest problem right now.
I mean, I think it's worth very briefly point. I mean, I do think that someone doesn't have to say Jewish for it to be anti-Semitic. People do use Zionist as a stand-in for Jewish, but not every time Zionist is used is it a stand-in for Jewish. It's obviously
there are Zionists. There are Zionist Christian like evangelicals. The biggest Zionist lobby in the United States is Christian evangelicals. A lot of these people going on tour to they go to Israel on their holidays and say, "Oh, this is where the end of the world's going to happen." Great, and they're going from Salt Lake City in Utah. It doesn't necessarily mean Jewish people. No. Really important. Michael Gove, is he Jewish?
But it can do. We're going to come back to this topic, I'm sure, again, because it keeps ringing its head in British politics. But that is it for this evening's episode of Tysky Sandwich. For the first time in a long while, was brought to you from the Novara Media studio. Thank you as ever to Ash Sarkar and Aaron Bastani. You can tune in tomorrow to the Bastani Factor. It's going to be a great show. Actually, I'm going to bring you in, Aaron. 1 second. Explain what's on the Bastani Factor tomorrow.
I am talking to Rashid Khalidi about his book, The 100 Years' War, which is a history, effectively, of settlement and resistance in Israel and the occupied territories. Very good book. He's the Edward Said Professor at Columbia University. as well as the author of this book. And he's a real authority on effectively 100 years of the Israel-Palestine conflict. So very much worth tuning into.
Great. Do tune into that. And as ever, if you want to support the show, please go to novaramedia.com/support. Thank you for all your comments and your super chats and your tweets this evening. I've been Michael Walker. You've been watching Tisky Sour. Good night.